Hello guys, this Science of Sport video looks at BTEC National Sport and Exercise Sciences Unit 2 Functional Anatomy, and in particular we're starting the Learning Aim B, which is all about the cardiovascular system. This is the first of 4 parts, 4 videos focusing on the location, anatomy and function of the cardiovascular components, so all the bits that make up this system. Now this first video, part 1, looks purely at the heart itself, its structure and its function. And the specification considers these aspects. So the chambers, of course, the valves and the other elements that enable the heart to do its job. Before we get into the heart itself, I just very briefly want to recognise its role in the system as a whole. So on the diagram on the right here, you can see we've got this heart represented in the middle here, and we've got a darker blue and a darker red arrow to show what we would call the pulmonary circuit. So this refers to blood that leaves the heart, goes up to the lungs and becomes oxygenated or reoxygenated, leaves the lungs and comes back down to the heart. So this little sort of mini circuit or mini system is called the pulmonary circuit. Anything pulmonary refers to lungs. So this would be the pulmonary artery going away from the heart, and this would be the pulmonary vein going towards the heart. The vein in this example is oxygenated, the artery in this example is deoxygenated, and this is the exception to the rule really. Generally arteries have oxygenated blood and veins deoxygenated blood, but the pulmonary circuit is the exception to that. So firstly we've got this pulmonary circuit from the heart to and from the lungs. Then the sort of slightly lighter blue and the slightly lighter red arrows represent all the arteries and veins that go out to the systems, the body's systems. And we call this the systemic circuit. So we've got this main artery leaving the heart, the aorta, which then divides into smaller arteries going up to the brain, going to the kidneys, going to the digestive organs, to the lower limbs and all the muscles all over the body. We've got these smaller veins bringing blood from those organs, from those subsystems back to the heart. So the arteries going out to the systems and bringing blood back to the heart via the veins is called the systemic system. Oxygenated going out, deoxygenated coming in. So actually these two are opposites in terms of arteries and veins being oxygenated or deoxygenated. Right, let's get into the heart. This video is mainly about the heart itself. So you should also already appreciate that heart sits just slightly left of centre and actually takes up some space for our left lung. That's why our left lung has only 2 lobes, not 3. It's about the size of our fist and it's a hollow organ. So we've got 4 hollow chambers because the job of the heart, as again hopefully you know already, is to eject blood, to pump blood out into the tubes, the vessels, the blood vessels that then transport this blood all around the body to our different subsystems. So on the left side, the job of the heart is to eject oxygenated blood at high pressure out to the systems, into the systemic circuit, out to the body. And the job of the right half of the heart is to eject deoxygenated blood up to the lungs, and it typically is at a much lower blood pressure. Okay, so we've got a left and a right side of the heart divided by a heart wall to keep these 2 different kinds of bloods separate. But the job of this cardiovascular system, and the heart in particular, is to circulate oxygenated blood from the left side of the heart, deoxygenated blood from the right hand side of the heart. These next couple of slides just go through that a little bit more slower. What I suggest you do is pause the video and take in this information. It's basically saying what I've just described. So we've got our pulmonary circuit here. Read this description and hopefully that will make sense of the right side of the heart ejecting blood to the lungs. So on this diagram here you can see these 2 sort of areas here represent the left and the right lungs. And remember we've got arterioles and pulmonary capillaries surrounding all the alveoli because this is essentially where gas exchange happens. This is where we reoxygenate our blood, we top it up with oxygen before it goes back down to the heart and then goes off in the systemic circuit. Here's a slightly more elaborate diagram of the lungs in connection to the heart. So just pause the video and sort of absorb this. You've got the right ventricle here and blood leaving the pulmonary artery, and you can see that from there, this deoxygenated blood goes to the left lung and to the right lung, where it becomes reoxygenated and gas exchange happens there. CO2 goes from the blood into the lungs and oxygen goes from the alveoli in the lungs into the blood. That oxygenated blood from the lungs then comes back into the left atrium and down into the left ventricle and goes off up into the aortic arch, out all over the body to the body systems. So the systemic circuit, again, pause the video, take this in a bit more at your own pace. Really, this just describes the process of blood leaving the left side of the heart, going out to the body, represented down here, and then back up to the heart for reoxygenation. I'd just like to show a very short video to try to encapsulate actually how the heart works and some of the anatomical features of the heart.
The human heart has 4 chambers. The 2 upper chambers are the atria, and the 2 lower chambers are the ventricles. The interatrial septum separates the 2 atria, and the interventricular septum is the partition between the 2 ventricles. The right atrium and right ventricle are connected through a tricuspid valve. As the name suggests, it has 3 leaflets or cusps. On the other side, the left atrium and ventricle are connected through a bicuspid valve. The bicuspid valve is also called the mitral valve because of its resemblance to a bishop's 2-sided mitre or hat. The leaflets of these atrio-ventricular valves are connected to fibrous tissue called the Chordae tendonae, which in turn are attached to papillary muscles. Contraction and relaxation of these muscles make the valves open and close. There are also valves at the opening of the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. These are called the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve, respectively. Because of their crescent moon shape, these 2 valves are also called semi-lunar valves. The characteristic double-up sound of the heartbeat is produced during the closing of the heart valves. The thickness of the walls of the 4 heart chambers varies with their functions. The walls of the atria are thinner than those of the ventricles, as the blood needs to be pumped into adjacent ventricles only. The left ventricle pumps blood a greater distance at higher pressure. Therefore, the wall of the left ventricle is thicker than that of the right ventricle. The sinoatrial node, atrio-ventricular node, bundle of HIS and Purkinje fibers represent the specialized cardiac tissue.
So I think that video gives a really nice overview of how the heart structures actually function to enable us to eject blood out of the left and right ventricles. So what I'm going to do is go through some slides, give you some rock solid detail in terms of these anatomical components. Again, I'm going to go fairly swiftly, so what you can do is pause the video to take in the information from the slides yourself. So here's an external view of the heart, just showing its location behind this flat bone here, this protective sternum and the ribs. And then again, we've got this external view. So this is from the outside. Here's a little bit more detail with some labeling. So some of these labels aren't completely relevant to you, but again, many of these features are. So again, this is the outside of the heart. What it does show is these coronary blood vessels that are on the outside of this heart muscle. Remember, muscles need oxygen and need the removal of waste products, and these coronary arteries is what provides the heart with oxygenated blood and removes the waste products. And you can see clearly here that the ventricles, these redder colouring organs, if you like, or parts of the heart, eject blood up and out of the aorta. Blood comes down and in these veins and up and out of the arteries. So this is an anterior view from the front. This is the posterior view from the back of the heart. Now the heart actually needs protection given that it beats quite frantically inside our body and there are other organs around it. The heart itself sits in, so if you imagine this fist is the heart, it sits in a double-layered sac or bag with fluid inside it. So if you imagine this was a continuous balloon, the fist would sit inside the balloon. So if the fist moved, got bigger, smaller when it beats, this movement is protected by this double-layered sac. And the heart's double-layered sac is called the pericardium. It's got an outer layer and an inner layer, and it's got pericardial fluid inside that double-layered sac, very similar to the pleural membranes of the lungs. So it's the same principle. And you can see here that actually the bottom of the heart is connected through fibrous tissue to the diaphragm beneath it. So here's a closer layer and a closer look and some more information about the pericardial sac. So the heart itself has a protective fibrous pericardium outer layer. And the sort of inside of that fibrous pericardium is the parietal pericardium. Remember, there's a double-layered sac. So here's the outer layer. Parietal is the same word as the pleural fluid. And here's the inner layer, which would be called the visceral pericardium. So this is the heart itself. This is the wall of the heart. And these two yellow layers are the two layers of the heart, including the fibrous bit here. So this is the double-layered bag, and this is the heart wall. The parietal layer, the pericardial fluid inside these two layers of the sac, and the visceral layer, double-layered sac, heart wall. And you can see also here, obviously it's taken this chunk here and enlarged it over here. This big, thick layer is our muscular wall, the wall of the heart, the myocardium. And you can see from this diagram over here that it's thicker on the left ventricle side than it is on the right ventricle side. I will mention that. Well, I think the video said the left ventricle has to eject blood to the systemic system all over the body, and the right side, the right ventricle, only has to eject blood to the heart, which is pretty much next door. So pause the video, take in the text information here. This is the wall of the heart with its double-layered sac included, and here's a close-up version of it. This slide actually, focuses in even further detail on the heart wall itself. So the heart wall has three layers: an outer layer, the middle myocardium layer, and an inner layer. The inner layer is called the endocardium. The myocardium is the muscular wall of the heart wall, and then we've got this epicardium, which is actually the inner layer of the double-walled sac. It's a bit confusing, that bit. So the heart wall itself has three layers: epi, myo, and endo. And it just so happens that the outermost layer of the heart wall forms the inner layer of the sac it sits in. Here's a more anatomical diagram of the heart itself. I just think it's important for you to get a real sense of what the heart might appear like, rather than purely diagrammatic versions. So you, of course, not only need to appreciate the anatomy, the structures that make up the heart itself, but also the route of blood flowing through. So typically we talk about blood coming in the atria, so in these two top chambers. What we should see, and this diagram doesn't show it brilliantly, is that the atria are relatively small compared to the bigger ventricles. The job of the atria is to receive blood, oxygenated blood from the lungs via the pulmonary vein. Veins go towards the heart, arteries go away. So a pulmonary artery goes away, the pulmonary vein comes towards the heart. So we've got the right atrium here receiving blood from the superior and inferior vena cava, from the upper body and from the lower body, comes into the right atrium, goes down to the right ventricle, where it's ejected and sent up the pulmonary artery to the two lungs, left and right lungs. The blood is represented as deoxygenated here in its blue colour. And of course, at the lungs, it gets reoxygenated and then is sent back down to the heart, the left side of the heart this time, via the pulmonary vein. The left atrium receives this oxygenated blood, passes it down to the left ventricle, this strong chamber, this thick muscular myocardium, which then ejects it up and out away into via the aorta to the systemic circuit. So that's really the flow of blood in the atria, down to the ventricles, and then up and out of the heart into the pulmonary artery and the aorta. So you definitely need to know the name of these four major vessels, the two veins, pulmonary vein and the vena cava, and the two arteries, the pulmonary artery and the aorta, plus of course the name of the four chambers. So some more detail, again, you can pause and look more closely, but the two atria, these top two chambers, have thinner myocardiums, so their muscular wall is much thinner because functionally all they've got to do is move blood down to the ventricles. The ventricles, larger, thicker muscular walls, larger chambers. The left obviously thicker than the right because it has a different job to the right. Pause the video and check that you understand both roles. Now the heart has 4 valves related to it. And again, you saw this on the video earlier. We've got 2 what we call atrio-ventricular valves, valves that are between the atria and the ventricles. That name almost makes sense, atrio-ventricular valves. So they allow blood to flow through them from the atria down into the ventricles. And what they do is they prevent blood flowing back in that direction. So we want blood to go down to the ventricles, but we do not want blood to go from the ventricles back up to the atria. So these valves are one-way valves to prevent backflow of blood. Just to be a little bit frustrating, they actually have other names as well. So the specific valve on the right hand side of the heart is called the tricuspid valve because it has 3 cusps, and I remember it right tricuspid valve. The left hand atrioventricular valve is often called the bicuspid valve, bi meaning it has only 2 cusps, or sometimes called the mitral valve or mitral valve because it looks a bit like a bishop's hat. So tricuspid, bicuspid, or mitral. They're both also atrio-ventricular valves. So that describes where they are. These names actually more describe how they're structured. Tricusps, 3 cusps. You can see them on this diagram over here. They're a little bit larger than the other 2 valves. Okay, tricuspid, bicuspid, those 2 there. The other 2 valves then, when the blood is ejected from the ventricles and sent up and out into the vessels leaving the heart, the 2 arteries, there are valves there because obviously when the blood is ejected from the ventricles and goes out into the vessels, what we don't want is the blood to flow back down into the ventricles again. So we have basically a valve here and here to allow blood through one way and to snap shut so that we prevent blood coming back through them into the ventricles. We want the route of blood, the flow of blood, to be one way. These are actually called semi-lunar valves. So semi-lunar valves or pocket valves. And the way they work is when the blood goes through them, and then if the blood tries to come back down, the blood gets trapped behind the pockets of this valves and the valves snap shut and stop the blood coming back in. So these are semi-lunar or pocket valves. They also have specific names based on where they are. So the specific semi-lunar valve leaving the right ventricle going up in the pulmonary artery is aptly named the pulmonary valve. The valve leaving that accounts for blood going into the aorta from the left ventricle is again aptly called the aortic valve. So they're quite easy to remember. The aortic valve is at the start of the aorta and the pulmonary valve is at the start of the pulmonary artery. Tricuspid, bicuspid valves. So again, a little bit more detail on those. Pause the video, take a closer look at this detail. You might need to describe, or you might need to identify on a diagram what is the name of this valve and what is its function. Okay, so that's the sort of question you might get. You might get a diagram of the heart asking you to label certain parts of it, to recognize the anatomy, and then to describe its function. So again, you might be asked to recognize what the right atrium is and what is its job, what is its function. Here's again another slide. You can pause and have a look on the two semi-lunar valves. This shows a bit more clearly actually the nature of these valves, the pocket. So blood will be, this would be circular and enclosed like this, but blood can go easily, happily that way, but when it tries to come back down, it will get trapped in this pocket, and basically the valve will shut like this. So blood comes through when it's open and gets snapped and trapped in this semi-lunar valve like that. Okay, a couple more bits of anatomy for you in terms of how the valves work. So there's some strange language here: Chordae, tendonae and papillary muscles. So firstly, let's have a look at this diagram. So you can just about see we've got the two atria up here, and we've got the two atrio-ventricular valves dividing the atria with the ventricles beneath. We know that blood flows one way from the atria down to the ventricles and then hopefully out into the arteries, down here and out in the arteries. We do not want blood, when the ventricles contract, we don't want the blood being pushed back into the atria. We want it pushed out the arteries. And to avoid that backflow when the ventricles contract, we need these valves to shut. So we need them to open when blood comes through, and we need them to be shut when the blood is being pushed out the arteries. And this is the job really, or the role or the function of the Chordae tendonae and the papillary muscles. So they've taken this side here, so this would be the bicuspid valve. And if blood was moving from the atria down into the ventricles, it would go through the bicuspid valve happily. And at this point, these little muscles here, you can just about see them at the bottom on this diagram. So these cords, really strong, tough cords, are connected to the wall of the chambers by papillary muscles. Now, when blood is coming down from the atria into the ventricles, these little papillary muscles are relaxed. Okay, so they are slack, if you will, that these cords are relaxed, and that allows these cusps to open and blood to come through. When this left ventricle contracts, the tendency of the blood would be to just be pushed up. And in a way, yes, we want it to go up and out the aorta, but the blood being squeezed here effectively could want to go back into the left atrium as well. Now, the way we prevent that happening is that the blood is stopped going into the left atrium by this valve shutting closed. And even though blood will push these cusps shut, what stops these cusps basically flapping this way and allowing blood to go in reverse is that these papillary muscles contract and create tension in the Chordae tendonae and stop them. So the cusps are allowed to open downwards because these muscles relax and allow them to flap that way. But when the blood tries to push through them and make them flap upwards, if you like, these papillary muscles contract, tension is created into these Chordae tendonae, and they're prevented from doing that. So these have a really important job in allowing one-way flow and preventing two-way flow between the atria and the ventricles. Here's just again another anatomical picture of it really. So the tricuspid valve would be just a little bit out of sight here, but this clearly shows the Chordae tendonae and a papillary muscle. I think this is the last bit of anatomy in terms of the internal structures of the heart. So we've got the septum. So this actually is a heart that's been chopped in half, and we can see the left side of the heart and the right side of the heart. And this big, thick wall that would divide the heart in two halves is called the septum. So in Latin, actually, septum means dividing wall. What we don't want is we want our left side oxygenated blood mixing with our right side deoxygenated blood. That would be bad. That basically would deoxygenate all the blood. So we have this septum that divides goes all the way from the atria down to the ventricles. You basically need to understand it as a septum, but a lot of anatomical diagrams will call it the atrial septum and the ventricular septum. But just understand it as the septum, really. So it's the dividing wall. I'll show you here, look. The dividing wall that keeps the left oxygenated side blood separate from the right deoxygenated side blood. Sometimes people are, or babies are born with a hole in the heart, and this again is problematic, and this is corrected with surgery because we don't want that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood missing, just to show that sort of as a explanation of the role of this septum, dividing the oxygenated and the deoxygenated blood. Okay, so I think this is the last bit of anatomy you might need to appreciate, and this is more external to the heart. So I think I mentioned earlier on, the heart is a muscle, and to work it needs a supply of oxygen, and we have specific or very specialized little arteries on the outside of the heart itself called coronary arteries, and these arteries provide oxygenated blood to the heart muscle. As you can see here, it spreads all over the outside of the myocardium. Really essential job, and of course we've also got coronary veins to remove the waste products of the heart muscle working. Just to identify as well that this would be the aorta, which leaves the heart, the left ventricle of the heart, with oxygenated blood, and the coronary arteries branch off this aorta. So the coronary arteries branch off the aorta, and they take or supply the heart myocardium with oxygenated blood. You may have heard of coronary heart disease. This is when, for various reasons, whether it's diet, whether it's stress, whether it's salt intake, whether it's inactivity, we can have unhealthy arteries, and they can become partially or very blocked. And these little diagrams here, show the different stages of blockage. And obviously, if you have a partial blockage, you may suffer from something called angina. If you have a complete blockage of a coronary artery, you essentially stop a section of your heart muscle receiving the oxygen it needs to work, and then that can basically can become a heart attack. So coronary arteries are essential, and we need to keep them healthy, and we need to keep them unblocked by nutrition, by diet, by exercise. Very quickly then, as I said earlier, this is the sort of question you might get. So identify parts of the heart's structure and describe the function of those heart structure. So when you create your notes for this, make sure A, you can identify the parts of the heart, and B, you know what they do. And this would be the sort of mark scheme for that question.